Hey friends, today I'll show you how to knit this market bag. This is a great little bag for groceries, gym gear, beachwear. It's eco-friendly, super cute, and so practical. In this video, I'll show you how to knit this bag from cast on to cast off. We'll go through the lace pattern, how to troubleshoot and keep organized, and how to create those cool top handles. This video includes timestamps in the description so you can easily navigate the video. So grab the free pattern in the link in the description and follow along. If you'd like to support this channel, then please consider buying a beautiful PDF of this pattern. It's totally optional, but I always appreciate your support. For the price of a coffee in a high cost of living city, it helps to keep this channel running. In order to knit this bag successfully, you'll need to know how to cast on, knit, purl, cast off, and how to knit in the round. What you'll learn in the video. You'll learn how to M1P, how to pick up stitches, backward loop cast on, how to knit two together, SSK, and how to knit lace. Construction. The bag is knit flat in one big lace piece. Then the fun starts. We'll pick up stitches along one edge of the lace and then cast on a bunch of stitches to create one handle. Then we'll pick up stitches on the other side of the lace, and when we get to the top, we'll cast on a bunch of stitches to create the second handle. Then we'll join in the round and knit in garter stitch to create those handles and the side of the bag. Et voila, the market bag is complete. Materials. You'll need 2 balls of Paintbox Yarns Cotton DK in the color Pistachio, a pair of 3.5mm 32-inch circular needles, a 36 or 40-inch needle would also work. You'll need a pair of 6.5mm straight needles, 1 stitch marker, and a tapestry needle. Yarn recommendations. This bag is best knit with cotton, linen, or hemp yarns. These fibers are hard wearing and they have a minimal stretch, and the result is a sturdy bag that can withstand a lot of weight without stretching out of shape. The lace itself is super stretchy, so we don't need to add any more stretch in the yarn. So for that reason, wool is not recommended. So first I'm going to use my 3.5mm needles and cast on 24 stitches. So I'm just going to use a long tail cast on. I'll link a tutorial up top in case you need a little reminder. So now I've casted on 24 stitches and we are ready to roll. Okay, so all we're going to do is knit 8 rows in garter stitch. And garter stitch is just knitting every stitch and every row. It's just knitting, knitting, knitting. So I'm nearing the end of the row. I'll turn my knitting over to my left hand and bring the bare needle to my right hand. And I can continue knitting garter stitch. Just knit, 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 knit. Now we have completed 8 rows of garter stitch. Now I know that I've done 8 rows because I can count up these little garter ridges on my garter stitch, right? These little bumpy sort of line here. And if I have 4 on both sides, then I know that I've done 8 rows. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And let's turn our work over and let's count the other side. Here's 1, 2, 3, and 4 is sitting right on my needle. So now I know that I've done 8 rows of garter stitch. Okay, so this garter stitch portion makes up the top part of our bag, and now we're going to knit the lace portion. So I'm going to take out my 6.5mm needles, and we're going to start knitting lace. So with my 6.5mm in my right hand, I'm going to knit right into the stitches here, and after we finish that row, all of our stitches will have transferred to the 6mm needle. Such magic. So we're going to start with a purl 1. So with my larger 6.5mm needle in my right hand, I'm going to purl into this first stitch. Here we go. So remember, our yarn is up front because we are purling. So here we go, purl 1. Now we're going to do an M1P. So M1P stands for make one purlwise. And all that means is we're going to take this strand of yarn right here between these 2 stitches. So between the stitch we just knit and the next stitch on the left needle, there is a strand of yarn running between them. So all we're going to do is pick up that strand of yarn here. I'm going to go in from the front using my right needle, and I'm going to just pop it onto my left needle, just like that, okay? So let's do that again. The strand of yarn between this stitch and this stitch, I'm going to grab it with my right needle. I'm going to go from the front, just pick it up, and then pop it onto my left needle. Now I'm going to take my yarn up front, and I'm going to purl into this strand of yarn that I've just popped onto my left needle. So I'm going to bring my needle into it like this. Whoops, little bit slippery. And let's try it again. There we go. I'm going to purl into that strand of yarn that I have lifted. Here we are. Cool. And I'm going to bring my yarn to the back and just tighten it up. So that was our M1P. Now we're going to do that all over again. I'm going to bring my yarn up front and purl one. And then I'm going to bring my yarn to the back, just tighten it up a little. You don't have to do this, I just do it out of habit. Now we're going to M1P. So I'm going to keep my yarn up front and I'm going to grab that strand of yarn, okay, between the stitch on my right needle and the stitch on my left needle. Okay, so I'll bring my yarn up front, just grab that strand of yarn between the two stitches, and then I'm just going to place it onto my left needle. And now I'm going to purl into this strand of yarn. So I'm kind of pushing the yarn so that it kind of leans more to the front, so it's easier for my needle tip to go in. And I'm not just sliding all over the place. I got it in, and now I'm going to purl one, and that is my M1P, okay? And now we're going to do it all over again. We're going to do a purl one, cool, and then an M1. Let's grab that strand of yarn between the two stitches, plop it onto my left needle, and then purl into it. So if you're having trouble kind of sticking your needle tip into that strand of yarn like I am, sometimes I'll just take my nail and just sort of pinch it and push it onto the needle. It's a little bit of a cheat, but I feel like it works really well. Then I'll purl into it, and that is my M1P. So M1P stands for make one purlwise, and that's what we are doing. We're making one purl stitch, which is why by the end of this row, we will end up with 47 stitches, whereas when we started, we had 24. So that is the M1P. Purl one, M1, purl one, M1, purl one, M1. So now I'm going to purl one. Yarn up front, purl one, and then we're gonna M1, grab that strand of yarn, place it onto the left needle, and grab it a little bit, put it onto my right needle tip, purl into that strand of yarn, and that's our M1P. Okay, so we're going to continue that across the row. So now I have my last stitch on my left needle, and all I'm going to do is purl one. There we go. Woohoo! So we should have 47 stitches on our needle. Let's do a quick count. 2, 4, 6, 8, 44, 46, and 47. Cool. We're ready to work our lace repeat. Now the lace repeat makes up the body of the bag. So we're going to be doing this stitch a lot. So let's settle in, buckle up, let's learn the lace repeat. So row one is going to be our right side. And all we're going to do is knit two like this. And then we're going to do what's called a yarn over. Now yarn over basically means we're going to take the yarn, normally it's in the back when we're knitting, and we're going to bring it from the back to the front. And that is all there is to a yarn over. So we did our knit two, we're going to yarn over, bring the yarn from the back to the front, and then we're going to do a knit two together. So we're going to knit these next two stitches together, thereby decreasing them from 2 stitches to 1 stitch. So let's do that. We're going to just knit into these 2 stitches as if they were just 1 stitch, knit into them, boom. And there we go. That is the repeat for row 1. Okay, so let's do that again, where we're going to repeat the instructions between the asterisks. So we're going to bring our yarn up front for our yarn over. That's our yarn over. So it's literally bringing the yarn over the needle. Okay, so no yarn over, yarn over. No yarn over, yarn over. Okay, yarn over, knit two together. So we're going to knit these next two stitches together. So let's go in, there we go, and knit into them, and boom, that's it. Yarn over and knit two together. There we go, that's it. Okay, so when we do a yarn over, we are increasing our stitch, right? So take a look at this. Yarn is in the back, now we've got a yarn over, and we're gonna do our knit two together. So take a look at our yarn over, right? It's just laying over our right needle. Here it is. Now when I actually knit into the next stitch, or knit into the next two stitches, as it were, like this, keep your eye on the yarn over. Okay, now it's off the needle. The yarn over is right here, and it has become an extra stitch. We've incorporated this yarn over into our knitting, so we've increased by one stitch. This yarn over is now a stitch. And the cool thing about a yarn over is that it creates this hole. So you can see where we did the yarn over here, there's a hole right underneath it. And where we just did our yarn over, there's another hole. So that's what a yarn over does. It creates a big hole. And that is pretty much what we want when we're knitting lace, right? That's what gives lace its lacy look. So let's continue working row one. Yarn over and knit two together. Now you'll notice that when we get to the end of this row, we will not have increased any stitches. We'll still have 47 stitches. And you might wonder why that is, right? Because I thought we're adding in more stitches when we're doing yarn overs. Well, we are adding more stitches, but you'll notice that we also decrease our stitches when we do our knit two together. So we do a yarn over, we're increasing by one, but then we're also decreasing by one because these two stitches are knit two together and they become one stitch. So here are two stitches. I'm going to knit into the two of them, and now those two stitches have been turned into one stitch, right? So as we're increasing by one with the yarn over, we are decreasing by one with our knit two together. So no stitches are actually increased or decreased. Everything just stays the same. So if that's very confusing and you don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine, just ignore it and just follow along with the instructions, which is yarn over, knit two together. That's all there is to row one. When we get to the end of the row, we'll be left with one stitch and we're just going to knit that bad boy. So I'm nearly at the end of row one. I'm going to yarn over and knit two together. And here's my last stitch, and I'm just going to knit one. There is no yarning over here, just a plain old knit one. There we go. All right, so that is our lace repeat. We should still have 47 stitches, and you can count them up. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, 38, 40, 42, 46, and 47. It's kind of tricky sometimes counting the yarn overs because they tend to sort of stick together and disappear. When you're counting them up, just sort of spread the stitches out so you can really get a clear count. We've got these big lacy holes, and that's what our yarn over did. So row two is quite simple. We're going to start off with a knit one. So here we go, knit one. And then we're just going to purl across the row until we get to our last stitch, at which point we're going to knit that last stitch. But for now, we're just going to purl. Okay, so when you get to the yarn over, you'll notice that it just looks like this strand of yarn on your needle. There's nothing mooring it in place. It's just a giant hole, and don't be freaked out by it. All you need to do is treat it like a stitch and purl into it. Okay, there you go, and purl into that stitch. Now we come to the yarn over again. It's freaky. It's just a strand of yarn. It looks weird. Don't worry about it. Just purl into it. Now, in case it sort of plops off the needle like this, all you need to do is just put it back on, okay? That's all there is to it. Pops off, oops, now it's off the needle, oh no, just put it back on, okay? No emergency, just put it right back on the needle. So sometimes the yarn over and the knit stitch that we did on the previous rows gets a little bit twisted, like for instance right here. All you need to do is just sort of push the stitches so that they're a little bit clearer, and then you can purl and purl into that yarn over. Here is a perfect example of it. It's just sort of crossed, right? So I would just pick it off, purl into that stitch, purl into the yarn over. So here's our last stitch of row 2, and I'm just going to knit this bad boy. Okay, there we go. And that's the end of row 2. Now we'll turn our knitting over and just continue to admire your knitting. Look how lacy and cute it is. Like, oh my goodness. Row 3, we are back to yarn overs. So we're going to knit 1. Here we are, knit 1. And then we've got our asterisk, which means this is the beginning of our repeat. So we're gonna do something called SSK. SSK is a kind of decrease, and the S stands for slip. So we're going to bring our right needle into the stitch and slip it right off the needle. That's one slip. And then we're gonna slip the other one off the needle. That's another slip. So that's an SS, slip, slip, and then we're going to knit these two guys together. So I'm gonna use my left needle, go into these 2 stitches that I slipped, and I'm kind of going in from like the bottom to the top. And then I'm going to knit into these 2 stitches. These 2 stitches that we've slipped have now become 1 stitch. So yarn over, okay, and then we're going to slip, slip, knit. Here we go, slip 1 stitch, slip 2 stitch, and then we're going to knit these 2 stitches together. Our left needle is going to go into those 2 slipped stitches, and then we're going to knit them. Boom. And that is our slip, slip, knit. Okay, let's do it again. Yarn over, slip 1, slip 2, and knit the 2 stitches together. This is not a musical. Why am I singing? So that is our slip, slip, knit. It's quite similar to our round 1 where we did a yarn over, knit 2 together. Here we're doing a slip, slip, knit, which is a decrease, and we're doing a yarn over, right? So the yarn over will increase by 1, and the slip, slip, knit will decrease by 1. So we actually end up with the same number of stitches, right? So yarn over, slip, slip. The left needle goes into these 2 stitches from the bottom to the top, and then we just knit those 2 stitches together, okay? So go ahead and work row 3, doing a yarn over and a slip, slip, knit until you get to the last 2 stitches. And now we're at the last 2 stitches, so I'm going to do a yarn over and then just knit these 2 guys together. Okay, so don't forget that yarn over at the end of the row. And that is it for row 3. Row 1 and row 3 are kind of the rows where we're really actively doing our lace work, right? Doing yarn overs and knit 2 togethers and SSKs. And row 2 and 4, our wrong side, is where we do our purl row, right? Our knit 1, purl all the way to the last stitch, knit 1. Row 4 is just a repeat of row 2. It's the exact same. We're going to start with a knit 1, and then we're just going to purl all the way to the last stitch, at which point we are going to knit 1, okay? So it's really just purling for row 4. Easy peasy. And the last stitch we are going to knit. Okay, there we go. All right, so that is the 4-row repeat of our lace pattern. Look at, just look at how cute and lacy this looks. Lace is just an incredible stitch pattern, you know? All of these yarn overs, these big lacy yarn overs, add a lot of volume to your work. Okay, so one thing I wanna say is that if this is freaking you out, like this whole yarn over, knitting 2 together situation is giving you major anxiety, what you can do is insert a lifeline. Okay, so after you finish like a 4-row repeat, you can insert a lifeline. I've got a video for that in the description. Just insert a lifeline so that if you mess up in future rows, you can always pull back your knitting to where you inserted the lifeline. We are going to repeat rows 1 to 4 until our entire piece measures 24 inches from the cast on edge. Settle in with that lace repeat, like really make friends with it because you're going to be knitting that for a while. So after you've worked row 2 or row 4, your wrong side row where you're just purling, you may have a predicament where you forget whether you're meant to work row 1, which is your yarn over, knit 2 together, or row 3, your slip, slip, knit, yarn over. So here's a little hack. When you take a look at your lace after having worked a couple repeats, you'll notice that some parts of the lace kind of go towards the right. Right, so let's take a look at this column here. This stitch goes towards the right, and then up here, this goes towards the left. This goes towards the right, this goes towards the left, and this goes towards the right. So just kind of try and notice this little pattern in your own knitting, right? Right, left, right, left, right. So the rows that go towards the right is when you are doing your yarn over, knit 2 together. And the rows where you're going towards the left is your SSK. So I can tell that this row was an SSK row, right? So this one, this one, this one, this one, when they're tilting towards the left. When they're tilting towards the right, so for instance, like this one right here, I can tell that this is a knit 2 together. So what does this have to do with figuring out whether you're working a row 1 or row 3? Okay, so if we take a look at the row immediately below, okay, our active stitch, it's tilting towards the right, right? Right, 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 right. So that means that we did a knit 2 together, a yarn over, knit 2 together. That was our last decrease row. And then we worked our purl row, and that would be this one right here, where the stitch looks quite neutral. It's neither leaning towards the left or the right. Okay, so that means we worked a knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, then we worked our plain row, and now we are ready to work our SSK yarn over row, right? Because the one we just worked was a knit 2 together. So that's kind of how you can tell what row you're meant to work, right? Either row 1 or row 3. Okay, so now I'm on the right side of my work, and I will work my row 3, a knit 1, slip, slip, knit, yarn over. So that's one way for you to keep track of your rows. Now, if you cannot see whether your stitch is leaning right or left, and this is confusing you, then don't worry about it. Don't even bother taking this tip on. Just mark down every row 1 and row 3, just on a little piece of paper, mark that down, and you can keep organized that way. Look how big my bag is now. So I'm going to get out my tape measure, and we're looking for 24 inches, and we have exactly 24 inches. So that means we can move on. So our pattern says to end having worked row 1 or row 3, and these are our right side rows. So the last row I worked was my right side row, and now I'm on the quote unquote back side. You can see that this side is a little bit more, I guess, purled. So we are on the wrong side, and that is the row that we want to be on. I'll get out my 3.5 millimeter needles and work the decrease row. We'll start with a knit 1, and then we'll just knit 2 together. So I'm inserting my needle into 2 stitches and then knitting them together. And now 2 stitches have become 1 stitch. And then we're just going to repeat that again. So we're going to knit 2 together. So here's 2 stitches. I'm going to push my right needle into both of them and then knit those 2 stitches together. And now those 2 stitches have become 1 stitch. And we're going to knit 2 together across the entire row. So here I'm nearing the end of the decreased row. Here's my last 2 stitches, and I will knit these 2 together. Boom. Okay, so now let's just count up our stitches and make sure that we have 24 stitches. And 24. All right, now I've got 24 stitches, so I have decreased correctly. Now we're going to knit 6 rows in garter stitch. Garter stitch on flat needles is knitting all of your stitches in all of your rows. So let's just knit for 6 rows. Now that I've done 6 rows in garter stitch, we are going to cast off. And casting off is very simple. I'll include a link to a video up top in case you need a refresher, but we're going to knit 1, and we're going to keep kind of a loose hand. We don't want like a really tight grip. Okay, we're going to go knit 2. Then we're going to bring that first stitch right over the second stitch, and then there was 1. And then we'll knit another stitch. So we always want 2 stitches on the right needle. Let's just cast off this row with a loose hand, and then we can move on to the straps. Now I've got 1 stitch left, so I'll take out my scissors and snip off a length of yarn. And I'll bring that yarn through the last stitch to secure it. Normally I'll wrap it around the needle, grab the stitch, and bring it over the strand of yarn. Pull through and tighten up. And there we go. Now the knitting is off the needles. So now you can see the bag taking shape, right? The garter stitch ridges make up the top of the bag, and we'll pick up stitches to create the bottom of the handles, and then we'll cast on stitches to make the top handle, pick up stitches for the bottom handles, and cast on stitches again for the top handle. So I know it sounds confusing, but hopefully it'll make more sense when we actually do it. As for these loose yarn ends, let's take out a tapestry needle and quickly weave these into the garter stitch. So I'm threading up my needle, and I'm just going to go into the purl bumps of the garter stitch. I find that it hides the yarn quite well, and I'm just kind of following the purl bumps, going from the bottom to the top, and then we'll do the other side as well. Before we get started on the handles, I need you to start looking for some bumps. Now, if you look at the edge of your lace on both ends, this side and on this side, you will see that there are a column of bumps right along the edge of the bag. So what I'm talking about is like this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. So these kind of look like garter stitch bumps, and you can really see it when you kind of uncurl the edge of your lace. So here's a guy, here's a bump, 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 bump. And on the other side, so again, we're just going to uncurl the lace and just try to identify those bumps. One side may be easier to spot than the other. So this side is a little bit tougher, but I can see it right here. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as I uncurl it, I can sort of see these bumps appearing. Why am I talking to you about bumps? So as we are picking up stitches for the handles, we're actually going to be picking up stitches inside these bumps. So just take a couple minutes and look for the bumps along the edge of your knitting, and then we'll get started picking up these bumps. We're going to use our 3.5mm needle, and we're going to have the right side of our bag facing up, which is what we have going on. Okay, so now we are going to pick up 5 stitches from the top of the garter stitch edge. So basically right here, we're going to pick up 5 stitches. So I'm going to take out my yarn, just unspool a little bit here. I'm going to use my smaller needle and just poke it into kind of the top of the cast on edge. And then I'm going to take my yarn and loop it around the needle and pull a stitch through. Boom. Now that is my first stitch that I've picked up, and I just have like a 4 or 5 inch tail right here. So I'm going to use the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn to continue picking up stitches. So this is our first picked up stitch. Next I'm going to pick up my second stitch along the garter stitch edge. I want to pick up 5 stitches. So here I'm just going to kind of casually space them out. I poked my needle in and I'm going to pull out a second stitch. There we go. And we're going to continue doing this. I'm going to go into like maybe just down here. And here's my third stitch that I pulled out. And we've got 2 more stitches left. I'm going to push my needle into the edge of the garter stitch fabric, wrap my yarn around it, and pull out a loop, which is now our 4th stitch. Okay, so we have 1 more stitch left, and I'm just going to poke my needle in here, wrap my yarn around the needle, and pull out a 5th stitch. So now I've got 5 stitches picked up from the garter stitch edge. Cool. Our instructions say pick up 20 stitches along each garter bump on the lace edge. Okay, so remember we talked about the bumps, right? Well, this is where we are going to put our bump spotting skills to the test. So I'm going to start looking for the next bump along the edge of my bag. So I think the next bump is like right here, okay? I can see this little bumpy. So I'm going to just stick my needle in it and wrap my yarn around, and that's my stitch, okay? That's 1. And we need to pick up 20 stitches. So let's look for the next bump. Let's see, I think it's going to be this guy right here. So I'm going to stick my needle in, wrap my yarn around it, and pull out a stitch. Cool. So here it looks like a little bump. So I'll just stick my needle in it, wrap my yarn around, pull out a stitch. And here's another one. So let's push our needle in, wrap my yarn around, pull out a stitch. And hopefully you are kind of getting into a rhythm here and able to identify those bumps. If you feel like you're unsure whether there is or isn't a bump, you can just skip it or go into the bump, you know, it's not a huge deal. The bumps are kind of our way of spacing out the stitches as we pick them up. So now I've picked out a couple stitches and I just want to count up how many I've done. So we did 5 along the garter stitch edge, right? So here's 5. So let's start counting from here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. We've done 9 stitches and I'm gonna go into this bump here, the next bump. There we go, that's our 10th picked up stitch. And I'm just gonna pick up another 10 so that we have 20 stitches. So I've just picked up 20 stitches, and now we are going to pick up every other bump for 15 stitches. I'm going to take out a stitch marker, this little guy here, just to help me keep organized. So I'm going to put the stitch marker onto my needle. So I know that I've got 20 stitches here. And then from this point on, we're going to do 15 stitches every other bump, and I'll show you what that means. This bump I'm not going to go into, but I'll go into the next one. Okay, so I'm going to push my needle into this, and that's 1. Here's the next bump, not going to go into it. Here's the next one, we'll go into that. So every other bump. Here's the next bump, not going to go into it. Here's the one after, we are going to go into it. Yeah. Next bump, nope. And the bump after, yes. Okay, so we're spacing out our stitches in this middle portion. Bump, no. Next bump, yes. Bump, no. Next bump, yes. So let's see how many we've picked up. So here's my stitch marker, and we're going to go 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. So we've got a couple more. Next bump, no. Bump after, yes. Okay, now let's do another stitch count from the stitch marker. Here we go. 14 and 15. Perfect. All right, so what are we going to do now? We're going to pick up 20 stitches along each bump on the remaining lace edge. So that means we're going to pick up 20 stitches right before we get to our garter stitch. So at this point, I don't really need the stitch marker anymore. It's already served its purpose. We've already picked up the stitches we needed to. So I'm just going to undo it. And now I'll put the stitch marker here because we start our count anew. So we're going to pick up 20 stitches into every bump, which is kind of what we did when we first started along the lace edge. So I'm going to look for the next bump, and here it is. So we're going to push our needle in, pick it up. And here's our next bump, and we'll pick that up. And uncurl it, next bump, cool, pick that up. And a next bump and pick that up. And I'll just show you that if you pick up a bump that you didn't want to pick up for whatever reason, you can always undo it by just taking your needle off of that, pulling the yarn, and then it'll just kind of disappear, right? So here we go, I'll just pull it off and pull and it's gone, right? So you can fix mistakes in that way if you didn't intend to pick up a stitch or you want to reposition where you insert your needle, you can do that easily. We've kind of reached the garter stitch edge almost, so I'm going to do a stitch count from the marker. So here we go, 17. So I guess I can pull out another stitch 18 from here, but we're kind of short. I needed 20 stitches. So if this happens to you, it is not a big deal. You can kind of fudge it a little bit. So I might take out some stitches here and pick up stitches a little bit closer together. So maybe I'll pick up one between the bumps, and I'll pick up something in between, and then I'll pick up the bump, 14, 15, here 16, and then I'll go into the bump, 17, and then I'll go in between the bumps, like these little strands here. What was it, 17? Okay, 18, I think, and then here's a bump, 19-ish, and I think we can grab one right here. I think that's a bump. Is it bumpish, bump related? And 20, perfect. All right, so now I've got 20 stitches from the marker, and now the marker has served its purpose, so I shall take it off. And now we're gonna pick up 5 stitches from the garter stitch edge, which is what we did at the very beginning. 4, and then we'll go into the top bump here. And 5, great. So now I've picked up a lot of stitches across this one edge, all the way here. This is exciting. We are like kind of almost halfway through this whole handle situation, but now we are going to cast on some stitches to create the handle across the top of the bag. So we're going to cast on 85 stitches using the backward loop cast on to create our handle. We're just going to grab our yarn like this, and then I'm going to use my index finger and just kind of poke it up like this. So again, hand grabs the yarn and our index finger goes up like this, kind of like you're pointing at the hand of God. You know that painting? Okay, maybe not. Okay, so you're pointing up. And now I'm going to use my needle in my right hand, touch my finger that's pointing, and then grab the loop and pull down. And that is a backward loop cast on. So this loop on my right needle is now a brand new cast on stitch. Okay, so we're gonna do that 85 times. Grab the yarn, point up, finger of God, okay? And then we're gonna use our needle, touch our finger, grab that loop, pull it off. Second cast on loop. Okay, we're going to use our finger, make a loop, and our needle will grab the loop from our finger. Okay, finger makes a loop, grab the loop, pull it off the finger. Finger makes a loop, grab that loop, and off the needle. Okay, and then now you can see, you can just count up. We've casted on 5 stitches. So continue doing this until you have 85 stitches cast on. I've casted on 85 stitches using the backward loop cast on, and I'm gonna count like right from here, 2, 4, 6, and I have 85 stitches. So now we are going to do the exact same thing on the other side of the bag, okay? So we've created our top handle, okay? And now we're gonna pick up stitches along the bump on the other side of the bag in the exact same manner that we did on this side. And then once we get up here, guess what we're gonna do? We're going to cast on stitches again to make another handle, and then we're gonna join in the round and start knitting the actual handles. So before we pick up stitches from this garter stitch edge, we're going to make sure that our stitches that we casted on with the backward loop cast on are, to the best of our knowledge, untwisted. Once we join them with this edge, they're kind of like set. So we can't untwist them once we join with this side. So we want to make sure that they are as untwisted as possible. You can see that there's like a loop, right? There's like a kind of a border edge down here and then a loop. So we want to make sure that that border edge is all facing the same direction. So I want to make sure it's all facing down, okay? So as I'm kind of going through, I'm just going to kind of untwist them to make sure they're in the same direction. Yep, I think this is the same direction. Yep, okay? And just kind of move them down. So basically I don't want them to be twisted like this, okay? I want them to be facing as much the same direction as they can be. So here you can see there's a bit of a twist, so I want to just push it down so that they're all facing downwards, nice and uniform. Down here I can see pretty clearly, here's a twist, so I want to untwist them. And we're all in the same direction now and ready to join. Okay, so we're gonna go right back to the beginning of what's called the side pickup. I'm going to just stick it in to this top part of the garter stitch edge, and we're gonna pull out 5 stitches. So here we go. Just gonna pull out a stitch here, and I'll just tighten it up because I wanna make these 2 stitches kind of tight. I don't want like a big gap between them. And I'm gonna pick out another stitch. So we're gonna pick out 5 stitches from this garter stitch edge. Very familiar. So this side I'm going to go pretty quickly because we kind of already went through this, right? We've got 5 stitches along the garter stitch. Awesome. So now we're gonna pick up 20 stitches into each bump. So here we go. 1 bump, 1 bump, 3, 19, and here's my next bump, and that's 20 stitches. Cool. So I picked up 20 stitches along this edge, okay, minus the 5 stitches of garter stitch here. And now I'm gonna bring out my stitch marker again, just to kind of keep me organized. And I'm gonna pick up 15 stitches every other bump in this next section. So here we go, little reminder, we're gonna skip the first bump and we're gonna pick up the second bump. So every other bump. Okay, next bump, nope. Next bump after that, yes. Next bump, no. Bump after, yes. And now that's 15, great. So I'm gonna take off the marker because we don't need this anymore. And now we are going to pick up 20 stitches of every bump until we get to the garter stitch portion. Okay, so let's pop that stitch marker over. Next bump is right here. And we're gonna pick up the next bump because we're picking up every bump for this part of the pickup. So now I've picked up 20 stitches from here all the way to the beginning of our garter stitch edge. And we're going to pick up 5 stitches along this garter stitch edge. This should be quite familiar. 4, and right on the top here, 5. Beautiful. All right, so now we are going to cast on, using the backward loop cast on, our last handle to the top, and then we're going to join with this side of the bag, and we will then knit in the round. Now let's work that backward loop cast on again. I've casted on 85 stitches onto my top handle, and now I'm going to make sure that, again, the stitches are untwisted, that braided edge is all facing the same direction. In my case, I want it to face down. And here we go. All right, so my stitches are untwisted, and now we are ready to join the top handle to the rest of our bag. So this is where we want to join our knitting to, and this is basically where we first started picking up stitches. So this is quite exciting. We have literally come full circle. I'm going to grab my stitch marker, just pop it right onto my right needle, and we're going to start with a purl row. So we're going to work garter stitch in the round. I'm going to bring my yarn up front, And now, instead of just purling into that first stitch like this, I'm actually going to purl into 2 stitches. And by doing that, I make that join really nice and tight. I don't want a little gap, and purling into 2 stitches will make that happen. So I'm going to insert my needle into those 2 stitches from the top to the bottom because I'm purling. And then I'm gonna purl into those 2 stitches as if they were one, and then pop them off the needle, and I'll bring my yarn to the back to just really tighten up that stitch. So now 2 stitches have become 1 stitch. All right, so let's continue purling. I'm just going to purl every stitch in this round, and you'll notice that after each purl, I kind of bring the yarn to the back to just tighten it up. I want this handle to be really nice and tight, nice and sturdy, so that's why I'm doing it. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. For me, it's just a habit. From this point on, we are just going to be knitting garter stitch in the round, which consists of purling 1 round and knitting 1 round. Purling 1 round, knitting 1 round. So that's really all there is from this point out. As you near that place where the side of the bag joins the top handle, so basically right here, I'm gonna purl these 2 stitches together, the last stitch of the side and the first stitch of the top handle. So here we go, I'm just gonna purl these 2 stitches together and just wanna create a nice tight join, bringing the yarn to the back just to tighten up that stitch. And when you're knitting the top handle, it's a little bit finicky, so you kind of have to keep pushing these stitches up close to the tip of your needle. And it's also just a little bit slippery, you know, so you got to be a bit careful as you are knitting these stitches. It's just for this first round, and make sure that the tip of our needle is really inside that stitch. There we go. Just taking it real slow, okay? And you can see that where we purled those 2 stitches together, that join looks really nice, right? Nice and tight. When you get to the last stitch of the top handle and the first stitch of the garter stitch edge, I'm going to purl these 2 stitches together just to create a really nice, perfect little join. And there we go, beautiful. And bring the yarn to the back, tighten it up, bring it back to the front, and just continue purling as normal. And as I mentioned earlier, you really only need to do this for this first round. Here's our last stitch. Beautiful, and purl, boom. All right, so we've just completed our first round purling, and I'm gonna bring my stitch marker over to the right needle, and now we are going to knit all of our stitches. I'm not going to be knitting 2 together anymore. We've already done that on our first purl round. So now we're just going to be knitting all of our stitches. We're going to be doing garter stitch in the round, which is purling 1 round, which we just did, and knitting 1 round, which we are doing now. And we are just going to repeat these 2 rounds, knitting and purling, for a total of 8 rounds. We have completed 8 rounds of garter stitch, and you can count up those garter stitch ridges, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, perfect. And on the back side, we've also got 1, 2, 3, and 4 is just right on the needle. Perfect. So now we're going to cast off loosely. So we're just gonna go knit 1, knit 2, and slip our first stitch over the second stitch. So remember to keep a loose hand as you are casting off. You want that bag strap to be somewhat stretchy, not super crazy tight. And now I've only have 1 stitch on my needle, and I'm gonna take out my scissors and just cut off a length of yarn. Take the yarn, bring it over my needle, and bring this stitch on my needle over that strand of yarn and pull it through. So here we are. This is our beautiful market bag, and you may think that the straps are like a little bit short, but the great thing about garter stitch is that it stretches quite a lot, and as you put items in the bag, you'll notice that it stretches out the bag. Everything will kind of stretch out a little bit. So let's do some finishing touches. We are going to take out our tapestry needle and just weave in these little ends here, the strand of yarn. But oh my gosh, just take a moment and like just admire this bag. If you've gotten to this point, like, you are a rock star. This is so exciting. And ta-da! Here is the finished market bag. I hope you enjoyed this knit. Please like this video if you liked it and subscribe for more videos like this one. I'm Davina from sheepandstitch.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!